She never imagined that one lie told on a desperate night would change the course of her entire life. But as she stood in the mirror of a luxury hotel suite adjusting a borrowed diamond necklace that cost more than her yearly salary, she knew there was no turning back now. Because tonight, she wasn't just Emily Carter, a struggling event planner trying to survive in New York City. Tonight, she was supposed to be the girlfriend of Lucas Hale, the cold, untouchable CEO of Hale International, a man whose name alone could silence boardrooms and move stock markets. And all of this had started just hours earlier when her best friend begged her to help with a favor that sounded harmless at first. Just one night, just pretend, just smile and stand beside him at a high-profile charity gala, meant to impress investors who demanded proof that the ruthless CEO had a softer, more human side. But Emily hadn't understood then that men like Lucas Hale didn't pretend without consequences, and as she stepped out of the bedroom into the softly lit living area of the suite, she found him waiting, tall and composed, in a perfectly tailored black suit, his sharp eyes lifting to meet hers with a look that was unreadable, assessing, as if you were already trying to figure out where she fit into his world. And in that moment, her heart betrayed her by racing, because Lucas Hale wasn't just powerful, he was devastatingly handsome in a way that felt dangerous, the kind of men women warned each other about, the kind who took control of every room he entered. And when he spoke her name for the first time, his voice was calm and commanding, reminding her of the rules in a tone that made it clear this wasn't a game to him. No mistakes, no improvisation. Stay close, smile when he smiled, and most importantly, don't fall in love. A warning that would have sounded ridiculous if the way he looked at her hadn't already made her stomach tighten. And as they arrived at the gala, surrounded by flashing cameras and whispered curiosity, Emily realized how convincing the illusion felt, how naturally Lucas's hand rested at the small of her back, how easily he leaned in to murmur things meant only for her ears, creating the image of intimacy that fooled everyone watching, including herself. And for the first time in years, she felt seen, valued, as if for one night she belonged in a world of power and elegance instead of constantly struggling just to pay rent. But the lie deepened with every step, with every introduction as his girlfriend, with every smile she forced, while her emotions tangled into something dangerously real. And the moment that sealed her fate came when Lucas unexpectedly defended her during a tense conversation with a rival executive, his protective tone sharp and unquestionable, making it clear to everyone present that she mattered to him. And in that instant, Emily forgot the rules, forgot the contract, forgot that this was supposed to end at midnight, because the way he looked at her then wasn't rehearsed or strategic. It was raw and possessive. And when the gala ended and they returned to the quiet of the suite, the air between them heavy with everything left unsaid, Emily prepared herself to walk away, to thank him and return to her normal life. But Lucas stopped her with a single sentence spoken low and firm, telling her that the night wasn't over yet. And as she turned to face him, she realized with a sudden, chilling clarity that pretending to be the CEO's girlfriend for one night had awakened something in him that he had no intention of letting go of, and something in her that was already too deeply entangled to escape easily. Emily told herself that the reason her hands were shaking as she reached for her coat was exhaustion, not the way Lucas Hale's eyes followed her every movement with an intensity that made the quiet luxury suite feel smaller, heavier, as if the walls themselves were listening. Because this was supposed to be simple, a clean ending, a polite goodbye, and then she would disappear back into her ordinary life where men like him existed only on magazine covers and financial headlines. But Lucas didn't move aside to let her pass, didn't soften his expression or offer a courteous thank you the way she expected a powerful CEO would after a successful arrangement. Instead, he stood there like a barrier, calm and immovable, asking her if she believed the lie they had just sold to an entire room full of investors. And when she hesitated, he stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne and feel the heat of him, telling her that people didn't respond the way they had tonight unless something real was present, a statement that unsettled her more than any accusation could have, because she had felt it too, the way the night shifted when they touched, the way his voice had changed when he spoke to her instead of at her, and she tried to remind him and herself that this was business, that she had been paid to perform a role, that pretending intimacy didn't make it real, but Lucas only smiled slightly at that, a knowing expression that made her feel transparent, as if he saw straight through the careful defenses she'd built over years of surviving on her own, and he asked her to sit, just for a moment, to talk, a request that sounded reasonable, but felt like the first step onto a path she wasn't sure she could walk back from, and against her better judgment, she agreed, settling on the edge of the sofa while he poured 2 glasses of whiskey he barely touched, watching her instead as she explained that she wasn't meant for his world, that she didn't belong in boardrooms or private jets or headlines, that tonight had been a favor, nothing more. But Lucas listened with the kind of focus that made it impossible to dismiss him, and when she finished, he told her that he hadn't asked her to pretend because he needed a woman on his arm. He had asked because he needed someone who wasn't afraid to look him in the eye and challenge him when he deserved it, someone who didn't crumble under power. And Emily felt something inside her tighten, because no one had ever described her that way before. And when she finally stood again, determined to leave, Lucas surprised her by offering a deal instead of an argument, proposing that she stay for 1 week, just one, as his public girlfriend while the buzz from the gala was still fresh, promising clear boundaries, generous compensation, and complete transparency. And she almost laughed at the absurdity of it, at the way her life seemed to be tilting into a story she would normally scoff at. But then he added quietly that if after a week she wanted to walk away, he wouldn't stop her, a promise that felt sincere, even though something in his gaze suggested he already doubted it would come to that. And Emily struggled with the choice, because logic told her to refuse, to run, but a softer, braver, more reckless part of her wondered what it would be like to step into a version of herself that didn't always play it safe, and she agreed, under conditions of her own: no control over her personal life, no interference with her work, and honesty, rules Lucas accepted without hesitation. And the following days unfolded like a blur of press meetings, public appearances, and carefully curated moments where Emily learned how easily perception could be shaped, how quickly strangers accepted a narrative if it was presented with confidence. And through it all, Lucas remained attentive but restrained, never crossing the boundaries they had set, which somehow made the tension between them worse, because the restraint felt intentional, deliberate, as if he were testing her resolve. And when the tabloids began speculating about engagement rumors and social media exploded with fascination over the mysterious woman who had captured the heart of New York's most elusive billionaire, Emily felt the weight of the lie growing heavier, especially when she caught herself enjoying it, enjoying the way Lucas checked in on her comfort, the way he remembered small details she mentioned in passing, the way he defended her when reporters pushed too hard. And the turning point came during a late-night drive through the city after a charity meeting ran long, when traffic slowed and the city lights reflected off the windshield, and Lucas admitted in a rare moment of vulnerability that he hated how transactional his life had become, how every relationship felt like a negotiation. And Emily realized then that beneath the control and confidence was a man deeply lonely, and she spoke honestly in return about her fear of being invisible, of working hard and still feeling replaceable. And for a few quiet minutes, there was no CEO and no pretend girlfriend, just 2 people sharing truths they rarely allowed themselves to voice. And when the car finally stopped outside her apartment building instead of his penthouse, Lucas was surprised, then thoughtful, as if realizing that letting her go home alone meant relinquishing control. And as she stepped out, he told her he would see her tomorrow, not as an order, but as a certainty. And standing there, watching the car disappear into traffic, Emily understood that the lie had already shifted into something far more dangerous, because even though the week wasn't over, the idea of it ending was starting to feel like a loss she wasn't prepared for. And somewhere across the city, Lucas Hale sat in the back seat staring out at the lights, realizing with equal clarity that one night of pretending had turned into a risk he was no longer willing to walk away from. By the third day of pretending to be Lucas Hale's girlfriend, Emily realized the most dangerous part of the arrangement wasn't the cameras or the rumors or even the way her name had suddenly become searchable online. It was how easily the role was beginning to feel natural, how quickly her body adjusted to walking beside him as if she had always belonged there. And that terrified her more than anything else, because she had spent her entire life learning how not to belong, how to stay small, quiet, unnoticed. Yet now she was sitting beside one of the most powerful men in the country at a private breakfast meeting overlooking Central Park, sunlight pouring through the glass walls while investors laughed at things she said as if her opinions mattered, and Lucas watched it all with a thoughtful expression, as though he were observing a transformation he had anticipated but hadn't fully predicted. And when the meeting ended, he surprised her again by suggesting they skip the rest of the schedule for an hour, something about his tone making it sound less like a whim and more like a decision rooted in instinct. And before she could question it, they were walking through the park like any ordinary couple, surrounded by joggers and dog walkers who had no idea they were passing a billionaire and the woman currently being speculated about on financial blogs. And for the first time since this started, Emily laughed freely, the sounds startling both of them, because it wasn't rehearsed or polite, it was real. And Lucas looked at her then with something close to wonder, admitting quietly that no one ever laughed around him without wanting something in return, a confession that lingered between them long after the moment passed. And as the days continued, the balance between pretending and truth became harder to define because Lucas didn't treat her like a temporary accessory. He listened, he adjusted plans when she looked overwhelmed, he defended her fiercely when a senior executive made a subtle insult about her background. And Emily found herself standing a little taller because of it, speaking with more confidence, seeing a version of herself she didn't know existed. But the illusion cracked during a late afternoon meeting at Hale International headquarters when a woman named Victoria entered the room, impeccably dressed, composed, and unmistakably familiar with Lucas in a way that went beyond professional. And Emily felt the shift instantly, the way Lucas's shoulders stiffened, the way his tone cooled as he introduced Victoria as a board member and longtime associate, a title that didn't explain the tension that sparked between them. And throughout the meeting, Victoria's gaze returned to Emily again and again with thinly veiled curiosity that bordered on scrutiny. And when she finally spoke, it was with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, asking Emily how long she had known Lucas, a question wrapped in politeness but sharpened with intent. And Emily answered honestly, without revealing anything, sensing that this woman represented something dangerous, something from Lucas's world that she couldn't compete with. And later, when they were alone in the elevator descending toward the parking garage, Emily asked about her, keeping her voice casual, even as her chest tightened. And Lucas hesitated just long enough to confirm her suspicion, explaining that Victoria had once been more than a colleague, that she was smart, ambitious, and deeply invested in both him and the company. And while the relationship had ended years ago, it had never truly disappeared. And Emily told herself she didn't care, that this was expected, that men like Lucas didn't come without history. But the truth was harder to ignore because jealousy crept in quietly, uninvited. And that night, as she lay awake in her apartment replaying the day, she questioned her own reactions, wondering when pretending had turned into feeling. And the answer arrived the following evening during a private dinner Lucas hosted at his penthouse, an event meant to reassure a small group of investors still buzzing about his sudden public relationship. And everything went smoothly until Victoria arrived uninvited, her presence deliberate and disruptive. And as the night progressed, she subtly challenged Emily at every turn, questioning her taste, her experience, her place beside Lucas. And Emily tried to remain composed, reminding herself this was temporary. But when Victoria finally crossed a line by implying that Emily was a distraction Lucas would soon tire of, something inside Emily snapped, and she responded not with anger, but with calm confidence, stating clearly that she didn't need to justify her place to anyone, especially not someone clinging to the past. and the room fell silent, the tension sharp enough to cut. And Lucas's reaction was immediate and unmistakable, because instead of diffusing the situation, he stepped closer to Emily, his hand resting possessively at her waist, as he made it clear that she was there because he wanted her there, a declaration that stunned everyone present, including Emily herself. And later, after the guests had left and the city stretched out below them in glittering silence, Emily confronted him about it, accusing him of crossing a line, of making the lie harder to undo. And Lucas didn't deny it, admitting that he was tired of pretending the way he felt was calculated, that something about her presence had disrupted the careful control he'd built his life around. And when Emily told him that this was exactly why the arrangement couldn't continue beyond the week, that she wasn't prepared to be pulled into a world of power games and unresolved attachments, Lucas listened, really listened, and for the first time, he looked uncertain, asking her what she wanted instead of telling her what would happen next. And Emily realized then that the real risk wasn't falling for him, it was losing herself in the process. And as the week approached its end, she stood on the edge of a decision that would either return her to safety or push her into a future she had never planned for. While across the city, Victoria watched the headlines shift and understood that Emily Carter was no longer a temporary inconvenience, but a threat. And that realization set into motion a chain of events that would soon test how much pretending either of them could survive before the truth demanded to be faced. The final day of the agreement arrived with a quiet heaviness that Emily hadn't expected, because she thought she would feel relief knowing the pretending was almost over. Yet, as she woke up to the soft morning light spilling through her apartment window, all she felt was a tightness in her chest that refused to ease, and the knowledge that tonight she would walk away from Lucas Hale's world for good forced her to confront how deeply she had already stepped into it. Because this wasn't just about luxury dinners or public appearances anymore. It was about the way he had started asking her opinion on decisions that mattered, the way he listened without interrupting, the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching. And she tried to ground herself in reality as she prepared for the last scheduled event, a private fundraiser hosted at a historic estate outside the city, reminding herself that people like Lucas didn't change. They adapted, and she couldn't afford to confuse attention with commitment. But when she arrived and saw him waiting near the entrance, dressed in a dark suit that made him look impossibly composed, the sight of him still made her pulse quicken. And during the drive to the estate, neither of them spoke much, the silence thick with unspoken awareness that this was the end of something neither had fully named. And the evening unfolded with an air of formality that felt almost ceremonial. Donors praising Lucas's leadership, guests commenting on how well Emily complimented him, every word reinforcing the image they had created together. And Emily played her role flawlessly, even as she felt herself pulling back emotionally, careful not to give more than she could afford to lose. But the moment everything shifted came when a sudden power outage plunged part of the estate into darkness, murmurs spreading through the crowd as staff scrambled to restore order, and Lucas instinctively reached for Emily's hand, guiding her away from the noise and into a quieter wing of the house, his grip firm and protective. And in the dim light of emergency lamps, they stood alone, the world temporarily narrowed to just the two of them, and Lucas broke the silence by telling her that he had canceled her final payment, explaining calmly that he didn't want anything about what they shared to feel like a transaction anymore, a statement that startled her because it crossed a boundary she had relied on to keep herself detached. And when she told him that wasn't part of the deal, that it complicated things, he agreed, admitting that he was past the point of pretending simplicity was possible, and he asked her directly what she planned to do after tonight, a question that carried more weight than it should have, because she realized she hadn't planned beyond walking away, beyond returning to normal, and when she admitted that she didn't know, that she felt like she was standing at the edge of something uncertain, Lucas confessed that uncertainty had always terrified him, that control was how he survived a world that constantly demanded more, but that she had disrupted that balance in a way he hadn't experienced before. And as the lights flickered back on and the noise of the fundraiser crept back toward them, Emily felt the distance closing, the careful restraint unraveling, and she made the decision to leave early, claiming exhaustion, because she knew if she stayed any longer, she might say or do something she couldn't take back, and Lucas respected her choice without protest, escorting her to the car with a restraint that felt deliberate, almost painful. And during the drive back to the city, the tension between them grew unbearable, every red light stretching the moment, every glance exchanged charged with meaning. And when they finally arrived outside her building, Emily thanked him for everything, for the opportunity, for the respect, for keeping his word. And as she reached for the door handle, Lucas spoke her name softly, stopping her, telling her that walking away didn't mean pretending what they felt hadn't happened, that some things changed people whether they wanted them to or not. And Emily met his gaze, steady despite the emotion rising inside her, and told him that this was exactly why she needed to leave now, before she lost herself completely. And she stepped out of the car without waiting for a response, climbing the steps to her apartment while forcing herself not to look back. But as she stood inside her quiet living room moments later, the city sounds muffled outside, she realized that leaving hadn't brought the relief she expected, only an ache that settled deep and persistent. And across town, Lucas sat in his parked car long after she disappeared inside, hands resting on the steering wheel, confronting the unfamiliar realization that for the first time in years, something he wanted couldn't be acquired through strategy or negotiation. And as Emily tried to fall asleep, her phone buzzed with a notification she didn't expect, a breaking news alert announcing a major internal shakeup at Hale International, involving board member Victoria Shaw, a development that made her heart sink with a sense of foreboding, because even though she had walked away, the world she had briefly entered was already pulling her back, and she understood with quiet dread that pretending to be the CEO's girlfriend was over, but the consequences of that night were only beginning to unfold. The morning after the fundraiser brought a tension Emily hadn't anticipated, a weight she could feel in every step as she entered the office where her life had always felt ordinary, but now seemed impossibly small compared to the world she had glimpsed for a week. Because even though she had returned to spreadsheets, phone calls, and client emails, the memory of Lucas Hale's touch, his voice, and the intensity of his gaze lingered like a shadow. And every time she closed her eyes, she could see him standing in the dimly lit hall of the estate, holding her hand as if letting go had never been an option. And she tried to bury those thoughts as she poured herself coffee and checked her schedule, only to find a message on her phone that froze her completely. Lucas had requested a meeting, not formal, not professional, just her, alone, at the city penthouse. And despite telling herself she wouldn't go, that she couldn't afford to return to that world, she found herself agreeing, because something about the way he had ended the night left questions dangling that refused to be ignored. And when she arrived, the elevator ride up was long, and the doors opened to reveal Lucas standing with a subtle, unreadable expression, the kind that made Emily's stomach twist with anticipation and fear. And he didn't waste words asking how she was. Instead, he led her to the living room, where soft jazz played in the background, and the city skyline stretched endlessly through floor-to-ceiling windows. And he told her that the news from last night had changed everything, that Victoria Shaw had attempted to leverage her old relationship with him to influence the board's decisions. And for the first time, Emily realized the precariousness of the position she had been in, how close she had been to stepping into a conflict far larger than herself. And Lucas explained that she had been more than a distraction during the fundraiser. She had inadvertently demonstrated qualities he had admired, qualities that had surprised even him. And Emily struggled to process it all, the adrenaline, the fear, and the dangerous pull she felt toward him, because hearing him speak honestly about her impact left her wondering if any of it had ever been pretend. And before she could respond, Lucas suggested they leave the apartment and go for a drive, not for meetings or appearances, just to talk. And as the city lights blurred past during their quiet ride, Emily found herself opening up about fears she hadn't shared with anyone, about insecurities, doubts, and the strange guilt she felt for enjoying her week beside him. And Lucas listened without interruption, but when he finally spoke, he admitted something startling. He had grown attached, more than he intended, more than he had allowed himself to acknowledge, and Emily felt her own heartbeat spike, because despite her best efforts, she realized she had also grown attached. And when she tried to rationalize it, to convince herself it was temporary, Lucas added that the board would now question every move she made, that staying away might be impossible, because her name was tied to his in the media, and every photo, every article, every social media post had created a narrative that couldn't simply vanish. And Emily felt panic rising, yet underneath it all was an undeniable thrill at being seen, at mattering in a way she had never experienced before. And when Lucas parked near a quiet pier, the water reflecting city lights like scattered diamonds, he finally asked her what she wanted, not as a role to play, not as a favor, but honestly. And Emily found herself speaking truths she hadn't allowed herself to voice even to her closest friends, admitting that part of her wanted more, wanted to explore what was real beneath the pretending. And Lucas smiled, a soft, rare expression that made her breath catch, telling her that he felt the same. And in that moment, the rules, the contracts, the fake appearances all fell away in an almost dangerous simplicity. And before she could respond fully, a car pulled up across the pier, Victoria stepping out with an imperious air and a smirk that made Emily's stomach sink. And Lucas stiffened, shielding Emily instinctively, and Victoria's presence reminded her sharply that the world Lucas inhabited was not a place for ordinary people to stay for long, that danger and politics always lurked just beyond the windows of wealth and power. And as Victoria approached, Lucas's hand tightened briefly over hers, a silent message that he was no longer pretending she didn't matter. And Emily understood in a flash that the week of pretending was over, but the real challenge, the one that would define who they both were, had only just begun. And in that moment, with the city lights shimmering and the cool night air braiding at her cheeks, Emily realized that she was no longer just a guest in his world. She was a player in a game that would demand courage, honesty, and perhaps the willingness to risk everything for a chance at something real. Emily could feel the tension in the air the moment she stepped into the corporate boardroom, the kind of tension that made the polished mahogany table seem heavier, the kind of tension that warned her this was no longer about pretending or temporary arrangements, because Lucas Hale had summoned her here for a reason that felt larger than she could immediately comprehend. And as she walked toward the center of the room, heels clicking against the polished floor, she saw the faces of the board members watching her like a hawk assessing prey, their eyes sharp, calculating, curious, and among them sat Victoria Shaw, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes glinting with that same unmistakable intent Emily had learned to recognize, a combination of curiosity, challenge, and subtle threat. And Emily felt her stomach knot, because she understood that this meeting wasn't just about business, it was a test, a confrontation of reputations, alliances, and unspoken power, and she had only herself to rely on, armed with nothing but wit, presence, and the courage she hadn't realized she had gained over the past week. And Lucas, seated beside her at the head of the table, gave her a brief nod, subtle but grounding, a silent assurance that he expected her to hold her own. And Emily drew in a slow breath, recalling every conversation, every glance, every carefully played role that had led her here, because the headlines, the gala, the fundraiser, the drives, the dinners, all of it had prepared her for this moment more than she had anticipated. And as the discussion began, Victoria spoke first, addressing Lucas with polished charm that veiled the edge beneath, complimenting the company's recent performance, and then casually adding a remark about the media speculations surrounding Emily's presence, a remark so pointed, yet masked with civility, that everyone in the room felt it, but no one said a word. And Emily's pulse quickened as the words settled, because this was more than a casual jab, it was a declaration, a subtle assertion of influence. And as she met Victoria's gaze, she realized that she could respond in one of two ways: shrink into the background as she normally did, or step forward and assert herself. And the choice was made before she even knew, because years of being underestimated had taught her the power of being underestimated. And she spoke, her voice calm but clear, thanking Victoria for her insights, affirming her respect for the company and for Lucas, and then subtly highlighting her own role in the successful fundraiser, pointing out specific actions she had taken that had contributed to the positive outcome, the room shifting imperceptibly as her confidence filled the space, because Emily's words were measured, precise, and undeniable. and Lucas's eyes softened, acknowledging the quiet impact of her voice, while Victoria's carefully neutral expression faltered for the briefest of seconds, enough for Emily to sense the challenge accepted and met. And as the conversation continued, Victoria attempted to redirect, questioning Emily's experience and suitability, but Emily remained composed, responding with facts, insights, and calm authority, creating a balance between humility and assertiveness that caught everyone's attention. And the board members began to nod subtly, recognizing the merit in what she said, the practicality behind her insights, and the courage it took to speak up in a room that had previously seemed untouchable. And throughout it all, Lucas never interrupted, but the way he observed, the slight tilt of his head, the intensity in his gaze, communicated more than words ever could. He was impressed, protective, and aware that Emily was no longer just a temporary figure. She was part of the equation. And the more the meeting unfolded, the clearer it became to everyone present that the narrative they had tried to control of a simple temporary arrangement was no longer accurate, because Emily's presence was not accidental, it was impactful. And when Victoria made a pointed suggestion about limiting Emily's access to future meetings, implying she was a distraction, Emily's response was measured yet firm, outlining how her contributions aligned with the company's strategic goals, her voice unwavering, commanding attention without demanding it. And Lucas leaned slightly forward, subtly placing his hand near hers on the table, a quiet reinforcement that he had his support, a silent message to everyone in the room that this wasn't just a role she was playing, it was her capability that mattered. And the room shifted again as murmurs of acknowledgement passed among the board members, because Emily's composure, insight, and courage had altered the dynamics of the meeting, and Victoria's carefully constructed demeanor cracked further, her smile tightening just enough to reveal the tension beneath. And Emily could feel the subtle adrenaline of victory coursing through her veins, tempered by the awareness that the game was far from over, that the corporate battlefield she had entered was unpredictable, and that Lucas's world, while dazzling and powerful, carried dangers and complexities that could not be ignored. And she realized that the power she had tapped into tonight was only the beginning, that her week of pretending had evolved into something far more real and consequential, and the stakes had never been higher, because the more she proved herself, the more integral she became, and with that came visibility, scrutiny, and risk, but also influence, respect, and unexpectedly, connection. And as the meeting adjourned, Lucas stood, brushing a hand across his suit jacket, signaling the end while offering Emily a small, private nod that spoke volumes about his pride and confidence in her, and she returned it with a quiet smile, feeling the mixture of fear and exhilaration that came with stepping into spaces she had never imagined herself occupying. And as they left the room together, the board members dispersing behind them, Victoria remained seated for a moment longer, her eyes meeting Emily's one final time, a silent acknowledgement that the rules had changed, and Emily understood that this woman was not just an adversary, but a measure of how far she had come, and she felt a strange surge of gratitude, because being tested against someone like Victoria proved that she was no longer the same person who had walked into Lucas's life days ago, that the lie of pretending had become a crucible for discovering courage she didn't know she possessed. And as they walked down the hallway, Lucas finally broke the silence, asking Emily how she felt, and she admitted honestly that it had been terrifying but empowering, and Lucas's response was quiet yet commanding, telling her that he had seen her strength, her intelligence, her fearlessness, and that she had exceeded every expectation he hadn't even realized he had. And Emily felt a shiver of both pride and fear, because the acknowledgement came with unspoken weight. Once someone like Lucas Hale notices you, nothing is ever truly temporary. And as they exited the building into the cool evening air, the city lights reflecting off glass and pavement, Emily sat back, absorbing the gravity of what had occurred, knowing that what started as a single night of pretending had now escalated into something that could define the rest of her life, that the boardroom had revealed not just her potential, but the intensity of Lucas's world, the stakes involved, and the undeniable truth that pretending was no longer enough, and that both of them, in their own ways, were already too entangled to return to who they had been before, and the knowledge was intoxicating, terrifying, and utterly irreversible.
The morning after the boardroom confrontation, Emily woke with a strange mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration, the memory of how she had held her ground still vivid in her mind. And as she moved through her small apartment making coffee, she could feel the lingering effects of adrenaline in her chest, a reminder that her week of pretending had already altered the course of her life in ways she hadn't anticipated, because she had expected relief, simplicity, and a return to normalcy after fulfilling her role beside Lucas Hale. But instead,
every glance at her phone reminded her that nothing was simple, nothing was over, and the arrangement had already evolved into something unspoken, dangerous, and impossible to ignore. And the first message that morning, a simple text from Lucas, reading only, "See me today," carried a weight far beyond the words themselves, because she knew his summons would not be casual, that his life was measured in minutes and decisions, and that asking for her time meant something significant. And despite trying to talk herself out of it, she found herself taking the subway downtown toward Hale International with a sense of anticipation that made her palms sweat and her stomach twist, because she was no longer pretending she didn't care, no longer pretending that the past week had been trivial. And as she entered the sleek glass lobby, security recognized her immediately, their nods a reminder that she was already becoming part of a world she hadn't sought. And Lucas met her at the elevator, his presence magnetic, commanding attention not through force, but through sheer aura. And when they reached his office, the city skyline stretched endlessly behind him, glittering in the late morning sun, casting shadows and reflections across polished surfaces. And for a moment, Emily hesitated, aware that this meeting would define the next steps, because Lucas's tone was calm but unusually direct as he closed the door, and he didn't waste time with small talk, instead beginning with an admission that surprised her, that he had realized over the past days that the way he felt about her wasn't something he could contain within the confines of a week-long experiment, that she had crossed boundaries he hadn't anticipated, that the pretend had begun to feel far too real. And Emily felt her pulse spike, because part of her had known this was coming, part of her had feared it, and part of her felt a thrilling panic at being acknowledged, noticed, and desired in ways that went beyond social obligation. And before she could respond, Lucas continued, explaining that Victoria Shaw had escalated the situation, subtly questioning her role in public appearances and making quiet insinuations to the board, that her presence was becoming a point of contention, and that he needed to know how she intended to handle it, because the stakes were now higher. And Emily, drawing a deep breath, spoke honestly about her apprehension, about the fear that stepping too far into his world would make her vulnerable, that being noticed meant exposure, and while the idea of power and prestige was tempting, she couldn't ignore her own limits. And Lucas listened intently, his expression unreadable, and then, almost casually, he leaned closer, his voice low and firm, telling her that he had no intention of letting her step away, that her value was beyond the superficial, and that the moments they shared had already changed him, that he wasn't willing to risk pretending otherwise. And Emily felt a mixture of awe and fear, because the man who had seemed untouchable and composed all week was now showing a vulnerability, a fixation that made the air in the room feel thicker, charged, and impossible to ignore. And she realized with chilling clarity that the game of pretending was over, that the decisions made from this point forward would be real, consequential, and irrevocable. And when Lucas suggested they leave the office, simply walk the streets and talk, she agreed, feeling that familiar thrill of danger and intimacy, because nothing about being near him was ordinary. And as they stepped into the bustling city below, the noise of traffic, distant sirens, and pedestrian chatter faded against the tension building between them, because Lucas's presence demanded attention, commanded reaction, and every step they took together felt like a silent declaration of ownership and care. And during the walk, he finally asked her the question she had been avoiding in her own mind, what she truly wanted. And Emily paused, realizing she had no prepared answer, no rehearsed response, only an ache of longing and the awareness that her life had already shifted irrevocably. And she admitted that she wanted honesty, stability, and safety, but the truth was, she also wanted him, a confession that trembled on her lips because it was terrifying in its simplicity and consequence. And Lucas's gaze softened, approving but intense, and he told her that the idea of safety for her was no longer something he could guarantee, because his world operated on unpredictability, influence, and pressure, but that he would ensure she was respected, protected, and never diminished. And Emily's heart tightened tightened because the offer was both terrifying and irresistible, and as they paused at a small park bench overlooking the Hudson, Lucas's hand found hers, and the touch was deliberate, grounding, and impossible to misread, and she realized in that instant that she was no longer a temporary figure in his life, that the pretend had evolved into reality, and the implications of that reality were immense, because involvement with Lucas Hale meant exposure, challenge, scrutiny, and an undeniable connection that neither could deny. And as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the pavement, Victoria appeared in the distance, her sharp eyes spotting them almost immediately, her posture stiffening as she processed the scene, and Lucas's grip on Emily's hand tightened ever so slightly, a silent acknowledgement that he would not allow interference, that boundaries had shifted, and Emily felt a surge of confidence and a tremor of fear, because the woman before them represented a history, a rival, and a reminder that entry in Lucas's world required courage beyond anything she had previously known. And as Victoria approached, Lucas's tone shifted, calm but commanding, instructing Emily to remain composed, to assert herself if challenged, and she did, meeting Victoria's gaze with quiet determination, refusing to shrink or apologize. And when Victoria made the first move, a pointed remark about suitability and appearances, Emily responded with clarity, facts, and subtle authority, demonstrating intelligence, restraint, and composure. And the moment froze everyone around them, because her confidence altered the dynamic, asserting that she was no longer a passive participant, that she belonged in that space. And Lucas's pride was evident in the slight softening of his features, the protective stance, the way he subtly reinforced her position without speaking. And as Victoria finally backed away, her expression a mix of respect and irritation, Emily exhaled, realizing that the confrontation had been a turning point, a moment where pretending had ended and reality, with all of its consequences, had begun. And as they walked away together, the city lights reflecting off wet streets, Emily felt a mixture of exhilaration, apprehension, and undeniable attraction, because the week had transformed into a reality neither could escape, and the thought of what was coming next, of the decisions that would follow, of the bond forming between them under pressure and scrutiny, made her heart race, and she knew with certainty that stepping into Lucas Hale's life was no longer optional, that the connection they shared had become irrevocable, that pretending had ended, and living the consequences was the only path forward. And in that moment, the cool night air, the bustling city, the distance between them and the boardroom, all of it became irrelevant, because everything now centered on the truth of what had developed between them, and the realization was thrilling, terrifying, and utterly impossible to ignore. The following morning, Emily woke with a sense of unease that settled deep in her chest, the kind that made her feel simultaneously exhilarated and fearful, because after the events of the previous day, it was clear that pretending was no longer an option, that the line between illusion and reality had blurred, and yet she had no choice but to step into the world Lucas Hale inhabited, a world defined by power, influence, and scrutiny. And as she prepared for the day, the phone buzzed with a notification that made her heart skip a beat, a calendar reminder for an urgent meeting at Hale International with Lucas himself, and she knew instinctively that it would not be casual, that the stakes were higher than ever, because Lucas never summoned someone without a purpose. And as she stepped into the elevator, she ran through every possible scenario in her mind, questioning her own preparedness, her ability to navigate a corporate battlefield she had only glimpsed briefly, and yet also wondering, nervously, about the pull she felt toward him, the magnetism that had grown in just a few days, and which now seemed impossible to ignore. And when the elevator doors opened to reveal the expansive modern lobby, security recognized her immediately, their nods a reminder that she was no longer a temporary figure, but someone whose presence had become noteworthy. And she walked briskly toward Lucas's office, her heels clicking against the polished floors, a rhythm that seemed to echo the rapid beat of her heart. And when she entered his office, she found him standing by the window, the city skyline sprawling endlessly behind him, the morning light reflecting in his eyes, a subtle tension in his posture, a silent message that what was about to be discussed would be significant. And without preamble, he began, explaining that Victoria Shaw had escalated her attempts to interfere, subtly planting rumors, questioning her place beside him publicly, and that Emily's involvement in the gala, the fundraiser, and the media coverage had drawn attention beyond what he had anticipated, and he needed her to be fully aware that every choice they made now carried consequences, because her presence was no longer invisible, it was influential, and the world would judge her capability, her judgment, and her ability to maintain composure in the face of scrutiny. And Emily felt the weight of his words pressing against her chest, because while she had proven herself in the boardroom, navigating personalities and asserting intelligence, the stakes now had escalated to personal involvement, and that meant her emotions, her attachment, and her connection to Lucas would be tested in ways she wasn't prepared for. And as she listened, she realized that the week had shifted from pretense to reality, that the dynamics of influence, power, and attraction had merged into something irreversible. And Lucas, noticing the tension in her expression, softened slightly, telling her that he valued her perspective, her courage, and her composure, and that he had made a decision to involve her in the upcoming negotiations, not as a token presence, but as a participant whose insights mattered. And Emily, despite the fear gnawing at her confidence, realized that the acknowledgement carried a thrill she hadn't anticipated, because recognition from someone like Lucas Hale was rare, meaningful, and transformative. And as the meeting concluded, he proposed a plan for the afternoon, suggesting they visit one of his private company branches to discuss strategy directly with the management team. And Emily, aware that this would bring her closer to the inner workings of his world, accepted, feeling both exhilaration and anxiety, because proximity meant visibility, and visibility meant responsibility. And as they stepped into his car, the city rushing past, the silence was comfortable but charged, each of them aware of the unspoken bond developing, the dangerous intimacy that had grown under circumstances neither had anticipated. And during the drive, Lucas spoke, not about business, but about the personal toll of his life, the loneliness behind wealth, the constant calculations required to maintain control. And Emily listened, realizing that beneath the power and confidence was a man who, despite his reputation, carried human vulnerability. And the realization unsettled her because she recognized a reflection of her own fear of exposure, her own desire for connection and validation. And as they arrived at the private branch, the staff immediately recognized Lucas, and Emily followed closely, absorbing every detail, every nuance of the environment, the way influence and authority were displayed effortlessly. And she noticed subtle glances from staff, a mix of curiosity, respect, and skepticism directed toward her. And she realized that once again, she would be measured not just for her role, but for her competence, her presence, her ability to command authority in spaces she had never navigated. And the meeting began formally, the management team presenting reports, projections, and challenges. And Emily, drawing on what she had learned, asked thoughtful questions, provided insights, and demonstrated an understanding that surprised even Lucas, whose approving glances bolstered her confidence. And as the session progressed, Victoria arrived unexpectedly, entering quietly, observing the proceedings with sharp attention, her presence immediately altering the room's dynamic. And Emily felt the familiar flutter of nerves, the unspoken challenge of asserting herself under scrutiny from someone who had history with Lucas. And yet, she remained composed, responding to questions with poise, redirecting attempts at undermining with intelligence and subtle authority. And Lucas, seated beside her, never interrupted, but his slight nods, protective posture, and measured gaze provided quiet reinforcement. And as the meeting concluded, the management team expressing appreciation for her contributions, Victoria approached, offering a smile that was polite yet edged with competitive tension. And Emily realized that this encounter had solidified her position, that pretending had transformed into influence, and that she had demonstrated capability and courage under pressure, earning recognition not just from Lucas, but from an entire professional ecosystem that previously might have dismissed her. And as they left the branch, Lucas suggested a detour to a nearby park, wanting to discuss the day privately, and Emily, despite her exhaustion, agreed, feeling the pull between them intensify because the personal stakes had become inseparable from the professional. And during the walk, Lucas finally admitted the truth she had sensed but not dared confront, that he felt protective, possessive, and deeply drawn to her in ways that went beyond the week's arrangement. And Emily, her heart pounding, acknowledged her own feelings, the mix of fear, attraction, and exhilaration that had grown steadily, irreversibly over the past days. And as they paused near the water's edge, the city lights reflecting on the rippling surface, a gentle breeze carrying the distant hum of traffic, Emily realized that the pretense of the arrangement had dissolved entirely, leaving both of them exposed to emotions, desires, and risks neither could ignore. And the gravity of that reality settled over them, thrilling and terrifying in equal measure, because living in Lucas Hale's world meant stakes higher than any she had known, scrutiny greater than any she had imagined, and a connection that neither could undo. And yet, in that vulnerability, there was power, intimacy, and undeniable truth. And as the evening deepened, with the city skyline glowing behind them and the subtle murmur of the city below, Emily understood that the choice to step into his world had consequences far beyond the original plan, that pretending had ended, that reality had begun, and that every decision, every glance, every word from this moment forward would matter, defining not just her place in Lucas's life, but the trajectory of her own future, a future she realized she was no longer willing to face alone, because the bond forged under pressure, scrutiny, and desire was too compelling, too transformative. And in the cool night air, with Lucas standing close, protective, powerful, and undeniably invested, Emily finally allowed herself to admit that the week of pretending had ended, but the real journey, the one defined by truth, courage, and the undeniable pull between them, was only beginning, and the realization was thrilling, frightening, and utterly irreversible.
The next morning brought a tension that Emily couldn't shake. A tension rooted not in uncertainty about Lucas Hale, but in the realization that the world they had stepped into together carried dangers, scrutiny, and stakes far higher than she had anticipated, because over the past week, pretending to be his girlfriend had evolved into something that was real, dangerous, and irrevocable. And even now, walking into Hale International, she felt the weight of every rumor, every glance, every whisper from colleagues who were beginning to piece together that her presence was no accident. And as she stepped into the sleek lobby, the polished floors reflecting the city outside, she could feel eyes on her, evaluating, calculating, and she drew in a steadying breath, reminding herself that she was no longer the tentative, invisible woman who had first entered Lucas's life, that her confidence, composure, and intelligence had already shifted the dynamic, and when Lucas appeared beside her, impeccably dressed and commanding attention effortlessly, she felt both exhilaration and apprehension, because being with him in public was no longer a role she could easily step out of, that every interaction was now a test of her courage and self-assurance, and the elevator ride to the top floor was quiet, charged, the hum of machinery and distant city noise amplifying the intensity of anticipation, and when the doors opened, they entered the boardroom where the senior executives were waiting, their expressions polite but sharp, and Emily realized instantly that this was no ordinary meeting, that something had shifted since yesterday, that the events involving Victoria Shaw, the media attention, and the subtle power plays had escalated the stakes. And as Lucas began the discussion, detailing strategic changes and expected outcomes, Emily listened intently, interjecting at key moments with insight, analysis, and suggestions that reflected both her intelligence and her growing familiarity with his world. And she noticed subtle nods from some of the executives, recognition that she was contributing meaningfully, and that she was no longer just an accessory, a temporary figure, but an active participant whose opinions mattered. And as the meeting continued, Victoria entered, her presence immediately altering the room's energy, her gaze sharp, assessing, subtly challenging Emily without a word, and Emily felt her pulse quicken, the familiar flutter of nerves mingled with a rising determination, because she knew that her ability to assert herself here would define her credibility, her influence, and her relationship with Lucas. And when Victoria made her first move, suggesting that Emily's involvement was temporary and perhaps distracting, Emily responded with calm authority, stating clearly how her insights aligned with the company's goals,
how her actions had already positively impacted outcomes, and how she intended to continue contributing meaningfully. And Lucas, seated beside her, gave her a subtle nod, reinforcing her position without speaking, a silent support that strengthened her confidence and made her stance undeniable. And the executives shifted in response, some with curiosity, others with respect, and the tension escalated further when Victoria, realizing that subtlety was failing, directly questioned Emily's familiarity with certain operational protocols, and Emily, maintaining composure, answered with precision, knowledge, and calm confidence, referencing past projects, procedures, and strategies she had observed and learned, demonstrating competence beyond what anyone had expected. And Lucas's eyes reflected quiet admiration, pride, and protection, and Emily felt a rush of exhilaration because not only had she navigated the challenge, but she had proven that she belonged in the room, that she could command attention and respect, and that she was more than the temporary role she had agreed to. And as Victoria's sharp gaze finally softened, acknowledging the unspoken victory, Lucas leaned slightly closer, speaking quietly to Emily, complimenting her composure, intelligence, and courage under scrutiny. And Emily felt her heart swell, not just from his words, but from the undeniable truth that she had earned recognition on her own merits. And yet the exhilaration was tempered with the knowledge that the intensity between her and Lucas was escalating as well, the subtle touches, glances, and protective gestures conveying emotions neither of them could ignore. And when the meeting concluded, Lucas invited her to join him for lunch in a private office overlooking the city, and Emily, despite her fatigue, accepted, sensing that these moments were as much about personal connection as they were about business. And during lunch, Lucas spoke candidly, admitting that he had underestimated how much he would value her presence, her insight, and her companionship, that he had initially imagined the week as a temporary arrangement, a simple distraction, but it had become something far more significant. And Emily, feeling both fear and excitement, acknowledged her own shifting emotions, the growing attachment she felt toward him despite her initial resistance. And as they spoke, the conversation turned to Victoria, her motives, and the subtle pressure she had applied, and Lucas confided that her interference was a reminder that Emily's presence in his life was real, impactful, and potentially disruptive to established patterns. And Emily realized that the risks of being near Lucas were escalating beyond personal feelings into a complex web of power, influence, and public scrutiny. And yet, despite the danger, there was a thrill, a sense of purpose, and a deepening connection that neither could deny. And as the afternoon waned into evening, Lucas suggested they walk through the city streets, away from the glare of the corporate environment. And Emily, sensing the unspoken desire for both distance and intimacy, agreed. And as they strolled beneath glowing streetlights, the city alive with energy around them, Lucas finally reached for her hand, a deliberate, grounding gesture that spoke volumes about his intentions, his protective instincts, and the depth of his feelings. And Emily, feeling the warmth of his touch and the steady strength behind it, realized that the week of pretending had ended, that reality had arrived, and that every glance, every word, every decision from this point forward would carry consequences neither could ignore. And she also understood that she had already crossed a threshold from which there was no turning back, because the intensity of the bond forming between them was undeniable, and the risks, while immense, could no longer keep her at a distance. And as they paused by a quiet fountain, city lights shimmering on the water, Victoria appeared again in the distance, observing with calculated curiosity, and Lucas's grip on Emily's hand tightened slightly, a silent warning, a signal that boundaries had shifted, that protection was real, and that Emily's place beside him was now recognized and defended. And Emily felt both exhilaration and fear, because entering his world meant exposure to power, scrutiny, and complex human dynamics, yet it also meant connection, influence, and the potential for a relationship defined by authenticity rather than pretense. And as the evening deepened and the city hummed around them, Emily understood that the week of pretending had irrevocably changed everything, that the decisions made, emotions revealed, and stakes encountered were real, consequential, and impossible to ignore. and that the journey ahead would demand courage, honesty, and willingness to embrace the risks and rewards of being in Lucas Hale's world. And as she glanced at him, seeing both determination and vulnerability in his eyes, she realized with a mixture of exhilaration, dread, and desire that the pretending had ended, the bond was real, and the next chapter of their lives, tangled, passionate, and high stakes, was only just beginning.
The week that had started as a pretense, a carefully constructed game of appearances and temporary roles, had reached its inevitable conclusion, and Emily woke that morning with a strange mixture of anticipation and dread, knowing that the final moments of their arrangement would define everything that followed. Because over the past 7 days, she had discovered courage, influence, and a connection with Lucas Hale that neither had anticipated, and the line between pretending and reality had dissolved so completely that stepping into the day ahead felt like walking onto a stage with no script. And as she prepared herself, adjusting her outfit, checking her reflection, and steadying her breath, she felt the weight of both expectation and emotion pressing down. Because she had not only navigated corporate scrutiny, social appearances, and Victoria's subtle provocations, but had also confronted her own feelings, admitting to herself a desire, attachment, and attraction she could no longer ignore. And as she arrived at Lucas's penthouse, the familiar hum of the city below, the glass and steel of his modern domain reflecting the morning sun, she felt the gravity of what was about to happen, because the week of pretending had irrevocably changed her, had revealed her strength, intelligence, and resilience, and she could sense that Lucas was aware of it too, his composure tempered by an intensity in his eyes, a mixture of pride, protectiveness, and something more intimate that made her pulse quicken. And when he opened the door, their usual formalities dissolved, replaced by a quiet understanding that this day would not be ordinary, that every word, gesture, and glance carried meaning. And without preamble, he led her to the terrace, the city sprawling endlessly behind them, the air crisp and fragrant with morning energy. And he began to speak, acknowledging the week, their arrangement, the pretense, and the truth that had emerged from it, admitting that he had never anticipated feeling such attachment, admiration, or desire, that the controlled life he had built, the careful walls he had erected, were no match for the impact she had had on him. And Emily, feeling a mixture of fear and exhilaration, responded honestly, confessing that the experience had been transformative, that she had discovered strength, courage, and clarity, and that she could not ignore what she felt. And Lucas, listening intently, took her hand, holding it with deliberate, grounding pressure, and told her that he did not want to continue pretending, that the pretense had run its course, and that he was offering something real, something consequential, something neither of them could have anticipated when the week began. And as the city pulsed below them, Emily realized the significance of his words, the magnitude of the choice before her, because accepting meant stepping fully into his world, embracing both the power and the risks, but also the undeniable connection, and refusing would mean returning to safety, normalcy, and solitude. And yet, despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, she felt an undeniable pull, a certainty born of the shared experiences, challenges, and moments of intimacy. And when Lucas finally asked her if she would choose to stay, to step forward, she took a deep breath, recalling every boardroom confrontation, every protective gesture, every moment of genuine connection, and she nodded, softly, firmly, saying that she was ready, that she wanted reality, not pretense, that she wanted him. And Lucas's eyes softened, a rare, unguarded expression of relief, pride, and affection, and he pulled her close, their foreheads touching briefly, the cityscape stretching endlessly behind them, the moments suspended between past, present, and future. And just then, Victoria appeared at the edge of the terrace, her expression a mixture of surprise, curiosity, and acknowledgement, and Lucas subtly positioned himself slightly in front of Emily, protective yet calm, signaling that the boundary had shifted, that Emily's place beside him was recognized and defended. And Emily, feeling a surge of confidence, realized that the challenges, scrutiny, and rivalries she had faced were not obstacles, but tests that had prepared her for this moment, for a relationship grounded in respect, power, and mutual attraction. And as the morning sun reflected off the
the glass buildings, she understood the week had changed more than just her life. It had shifted the dynamics of everyone involved, Lucas, Victoria, and herself, in ways that would reverberate far beyond a single week. And Lucas, sensing her reflection, smiled, softly, sincerely, and told her that this was only the beginning, that life in his world was complex, challenging, and exhilarating, and that together they could navigate it, supporting, challenging, and transforming each other in ways neither had imagined. And Emily, feeling the warmth of his hand, the certainty in his tone, and the pull of their connection, leaned in, allowing herself to savor the culmination of a week that had begun as pretense, but ended in undeniable truth. And as they stood on the terrace, the city alive with motion, sunlight glinting on water and steel, she realized that she had been given something rare, transformative, and permanent, the chance to step fully into a life she had never dared dream, with a man who had started as a stranger, then a pretend companion, and had now become something essential, undeniable, and real. And as they finally moved inside, the weight of decision lifted, the air charged with possibility. They embraced the reality of the choice, knowing that pretending was over, but the story, their story, was just beginning, full of risks, passion, and irrevocable connection. And Emily, looking into Lucas's eyes, felt a calm certainty settle in her chest, a knowledge that the week had changed everything, that the week had revealed truth, courage, and desire, and that whatever came next, she was ready to face it with him, because pretending was over, love had begun, and in that instant, amid the skyline, the sunlight, and the city that stretched endlessly below, Emily and Lucas understood that the consequences, the challenges, and the exhilaration ahead were worth every risk, every moment of fear, every heartbeat that had led them to this defining conclusion. And as the story of their week of pretending drew to a close, the final realization settled gently but firmly. They were no longer participants in a game, no longer acting out a role. They were together, fully, honestly, and irrevocably, and the city below continued to pulse with life, unaware that amid the concrete, glass, and steel, a story of pretending, courage, confrontation, and love had reached its dramatic, thrilling, and ultimate conclusion.